Eric has suggested how big some of the challenges are that are facing education. And we'll be hearing all day today about a variety of responses to those. I'm going to be talking about the response described in Chapter 3 of EarthEd, Ecological Literacy. Ecological literacy is not just one thing. There is no blueprint, there's no one-size-fits-all formula, there's no cookie-cutter curriculum, and I think finally that's also actually a strength. What I'll be talking about specifically is the approach that was developed by the Center for Ecoliteracy, which was founded in 1995 to promote education for sustainable living. The systems theorist Fritjof Capra, one of the center's founders, reviewed a number of different definitions of sustainability, and he found that they were all, in some ways, moral exhortations, descriptions of what the world ought to be like, but they were thin on practical advice. How do you do it? So he looked to nature. And this is what he said. We did not need to invent human communities from scratch, since the outstanding characteristic of the biosphere is its inherent ability to sustain life. A sustainable human community must be designed so that its ways of life, technologies, social systems honor, support, and cooperate with nature's inherent ability to sustain life. So this led then to the Center for Ecoliteracy's several definitions, and this is about the simplest of them. Ecoliteracy is the ability to understand the basic principles of ecology and to act accordingly. To understand how nature sustains life, communities, and then to develop the skills, knowledge, will, sometimes courage, energy, passion, to act on that understanding. Ecoliteracy answers for me many questions. Three that are most important on my mind these days are: how does the world work? How does change happen? And what are we going to do? What does this mean for education? Let me start with one of my favorite examples. Straw. Teachers and students restoring a watershed. Straw began in a 4th grade classroom in California. The students had just watched a film on rainforest destruction, and they were distressed. They came to their teacher and said, "Well, what can we do?" And she said, "I just couldn't give them a pat answer about write letters, make donations." So just as Fritjof had done, she turned to nature. A trainer she knew had suggested, pick a species, find out all about it, and you'll fall in love with it. And she knew she didn't want a charismatic species, not polar bears or whales or tigers. She wanted something local, and she wanted students to know that all species matter. So this is what she picked. It's a California freshwater shrimp, and for those of you in the audience, you can see it's huge. In reality, it's about the size of your little finger. It lives only in about 17 streams in Northern California, all within a few miles of the students' school. And frankly, the students really weren't that enthusiastic about it. But as they had agreed to do, they learned everything they could about the shrimp. They read scientific papers, they learned about its ecology, they learned about why it was endangered, and perhaps what might be done about that. The fact is that the shrimp is so endangered, so rare, that even scientists needed permits just to touch the shrimp when they could find them. And so it was 6 months before the students ever saw one of the shrimp, and rather remarkably, they stuck with it all of that time. Even more remarkably, they stuck with the project even knowing that it might take decades before anything they could do would affect it. I think a lesson there is that students are more amenable to really getting engaged in something than we sometimes think. They don't need to do everything with the speed of a video game in order to stay connected. In this case, they stayed with, initially with 6 months before they ever saw one of the shrimp. When they did see one, Lorette says, there was this big ah. It was as if they'd seen a movie star. They had fallen in love, they learned about it, and now they were seeing it firsthand. And so they had moved from despair to love, and then ultimately to action. We'll talk in a minute about what that action was. And how did they do this? And that's where ecoliteracy comes in. Straw, one of the reasons that Straw is one of my favorite projects is that the guiding principles which we had identified at the Center for Ecoliteracy for ecological education, ecoliteracy education, Straw embodies all of them. We identified 4 strategies, 4 guiding principles. Nature is our teacher. Sustainability is a community practice. The real world is the optimal learning environment. And sustainable living is rooted in a deep knowledge of place. So first, nature is our teacher, and everything in some ways flows from that. One caveat, I think. Taking nature as our teacher does not mean turning sentimental, soft-headed. Does not mean thinking of lovely, beneficent Mother Nature whose arms are around us and is taking care of us. In my experience, some of my best teachers are the ones who challenged me the most. And nature is that kind of a teacher. David Orr, a longtime Worldwatch board member and a longtime member of the board of the Center for Ecoliteracy, reminds us that nature is a ruthless and unforgiving bookkeeper. Nature is endlessly innovative, but also brutally efficient, in Alan Weisman's words, at winnowing populations that exceed their ecosystem's capacities. So nature teaches us possibilities. Nature also teaches us limits. Having said that, there is much that we can learn from nature. And I'll mention just a few of those lessons and what I see as their implications. Among the processes and patterns that we learn from nature, is that nature weaves webs of interaction and of relationship. Within the Straw Project, the students learned that the shrimp are one strand of a web that includes shrimp living in streams that run through dairy ranches. And so their web involves the shrimp, the streams, the plants that grow along the streams, the cattle that trample the plants, the ranchers that own the cattle, and that addressing this whole system really becomes not a shrimp problem, but a watershed problem. Understanding how that whole system works and where intervening in it, where there may be leverage points. So ultimately, Straw devised a plan that included students planting and then protecting willows and blackberries especially to shelter the shrimp and stabilize the stream banks, while the dairy ranchers built bridges and fencing to keep the cattle out of the streams. Nature teaches a number of lessons that can be applied not only again to natural ecosystems, but to maintaining human ecosystems, healthy human systems. And I'll mention a couple of those. Diversity assures resilience. Variety is more than the spice of life. Sometimes it's the foundation of life. Monocultures make systems vulnerable. That's true of agriculture, it's true of endangered shrimp, but it's also true of human cultures, true of endangered languages, it's true of ideas, political systems, and education. As the bumper sticker says, celebrate diversity. And that's one of the reasons that I'm glad that the ecoliteracy movement, and it's become a kind of a movement, has not yet decided on everybody's going to do it the same way, in the same time, in the same order. One more natural pattern. One species' waste is another species' food. Maybe said a little differently. In a healthy ecosystem, there is no waste. Everything has a role. And in a healthy social system, there is no waste. No wasted people. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Everyone's contribution matters. And in this sense, justice is an ecological concept. Here's a school that applied that lesson. The quote above the doorway at the entrance to the school from Matthew Fox, "Sustainability is another word for justice. For what is just is sustainable, and what is unjust is not." And they got it. And again, this is an elementary school. This is in Burlington, Vermont. Lawrence Barnes. It was the first public elementary school in the United States to be organized around sustainability. The other guiding principles we can move through a little bit more briefly. Sustainability is a community practice. It's a practice because it's something you do. It's not a state you arrive at. It's not a static condition. You don't reach sustainability and say, we won. You do it, you practice it, and you keep practicing it. And you learn to do it the same way that you learn to play a musical instrument or to hit a baseball. You practice it. And it's a community practice because that's how nature sustains life, by creating and nurturing communities. So how does this work? One thing you can take from that lesson is the way to proceed is to nurture networks. Pamela Barker will be speaking, I think right after me, talking about social and emotional intelligence, or learning, and among other things, developing empathy. Well, it turns out empathy is also a strategy for shrimp saving. The program's progress required a network of people who sometimes see themselves as adversaries, ranchers, environmentalists, for-profit companies, public agencies, public schools. And not surprisingly, at first the ranchers weren't all that eager to have environmentalists and 9-year-olds running around on their property telling them what they ought to be doing. And the students needed to learn that the ranchers weren't the enemy. They weren't greedy or indifferent. Some of them were barely getting by. And so finally, saving the shrimp meant helping the ranchers, not fighting them. And that was a set of prejudices that both sides had to overcome in order to be able to work together. They needed to spend time building trust with each other before they could go ahead and do the work of the project. And there they are, gathered at the circle at the end of one of their restorations, with the parents, teachers, students, some of the businesses and others who participated together. And the ranchers often became part of those circles as well. Another thing we can learn from nature is to ask the question, has anyone been left out? And that takes paying attention. This is a project we worked on in Berkeley. There's a school in Berkeley where the faculty had decided that they were going to create a very creative and kind of involved new plan for how they were going to do composting, how they were going to do recycling. Teachers were going to eat lunch with the students part of the time. And they were going to involve the staff. They needed custodians, they needed maintenance people, they needed to rearrange actually the way that the trash was collected and where it was and how it was measured and how it was handled. And so the faculty said, well, we're really going to need the rest of the staff. So let's talk about it at a staff meeting and get some enthusiasm. And it was only then that they realized that for a long time they had been scheduling meetings, quote unquote staff meetings, at times only teachers could attend. And they had never noticed who wasn't there. And so it took that realization on their part and doing something about it before they could move on. The real world is the optimal learning environment. This is the real world in New Jersey. This is the real world in New York. Students here are taking responsibility for the waste they generate. We sometimes think about schools over here, the real world's over there. You got to get out of the school and into the real world. Sometimes the school is the real world. And what makes a project a real world project isn't where it takes place. For me anyway, it's a real world project when the conditions, the challenges are not controlled especially by the school. It's when nature or other people or the outside community all impact the project and all have to be worked with to make the project work. Then it's the real world. It's also the real world when the results of the project matter for something more than completing a course or getting a grade. They matter to shrimp, or they matter to ranchers, they matter to people who need clean drinking water. And it's the real world when failure is a real possibility. The straw project was actually very risky because when they began, they did not know if it was going to succeed. But it took a kind of courage just to begin it. But along the way, they made mistakes. At one point, the students had planned a public event because they needed to raise money, they needed to create support, but they hadn't followed through with the invitations that they were expected to make to public officials. And the teacher saw that this was happening, and she decided not to stop them. She let the event go ahead, and it did not turn out well. But the students learned something from that they wouldn't have learned if she had intervened to protect them from the mistakes they were about to make. It was important for her to see and for them to see that you do make mistakes when you don't do it the right way, and you can learn from those mistakes and you can move forward. And that is another kind of real world experience. Okay. Sustainable living is rooted in a deep knowledge of place. Place can begin off campus. These are students getting knee-deep in their place in Wisconsin. The students can happen near their own place in the city. These are students from Lawrence Barnes who are part of a project where they would discuss what makes for quality of life. And then they would go into their neighborhoods. They would meet the neighbors. They would literally walk the streets, assess the organizations, the projects that were going on there, and then compare what they were seeing in their own town with what they had imagined to be quality of life for that town. And then they wrote report cards. They gave those to public officials, to local agencies, to the schools, and they offered to help do something about the things they had identified. And they got results. They improved their city. They got something else too, though. At one time, Lawrence Barnes was by all means a failing school. Parents were doing what they can to pull strings to get their kids out of that school and into other schools. The school was threatened with being closed. But after Barnes had gotten into projects like this one, reading scores went up by 22%. Math scores went up by 18%. And they weren't teaching reading or math in any particularly different way. What was different was that the students were engaged. They were doing something that mattered to someone besides themselves. And they were experiencing themselves as being effective. And that's what made the difference. Knowledge of place can also begin in the cafeteria. The Center for Ecoliteracy became involved some time ago in school food reform after we had discovered that what students were learning about nutrition in the gardens that we were sponsoring was being undermined as soon as they walked into the school cafeteria. And we had to do something to bridge that gap, to realize that what students were learning in the cafeteria, whether or not that was what had been intended, was as important as what they were learning in the garden. And that evolved through several steps into a program now called California Thursdays, in which school districts pledged to serve more freshly cooked, freshly prepared California food. The districts in that network now serve more than 300 million meals a year, and they're making a difference. They're creating incentives for distributors to produce California-grown product lines. This is in contrast to previously when the schools decided, okay, we want to buy California food, and the distributors told them, we don't know where the food comes from. Sorry, we got it. You can buy it or not. Now that they've created a demand, they've made an important social change. And the program has inspired Minnesota's Thursdays, New York Thursdays, Nebraska Thursdays. And it's also tied to learning about place. It's tied to lessons in which students use school meals to learn about their state, about its agricultural history, about its very rich ethnic history and its cultural history. Students here have been learning about the origins of all the various ingredients in salsa. And then they're competing with other schools to find out who can create the best salsa recipes. And I guess there's another lesson there, I guess that ecological education, ecoliteracy education, can also be fun. And as we try to say, fun is good. Being ecologically responsible is not just a matter of lowering your head and doing the right thing. Also, it can be something where you have a good time doing. So finally, ecological literacy, is about hope. One of the students we worked with told us that students can be motivated to envision responses to all these daunting challenges if they're not being fed the idea that it's hopeless. And ecoliteracy education is one effort to provide ways of finding out that it's not hopeless, that there are ways to become involved, there are things to do. The fourth grade students who launched the Straw Project badly wanted to know, what can we do? And increasingly for me, the question which faces me as an educator, which faces many of us as educators, is, what will we tell them when they ask?